Ukraine's killing power needs to be maximised. Now, it's a very blunt way of describing how Ukraine may be able to win this war. And even with maximum support, may I add, the outcome of the war is not decided. But I think everybody should be pretty clear-eyed about it. It is a war across a 620-mile front that is essentially now an attritional war. If either side can kill enough of the opposing army in order to break their capability and will to continue fighting, then that war will be decided. If not, then Ukraine could well be forced into a position where it has to make a loser's peace, ceding territory, and then having to brace itself for another round of war at a time with Russia at a time in the near future.
William Hague has written in the Times today that there's going to be no peace agreement until Russia runs out of men or Ukraine runs out of credit. Is it as simple as that, do you think?
That is a good distillation of where we are with the war in Ukraine at the moment, which has essentially become a battle of wills involving money, munitions, and the attrition of men. In order for Ukraine to win, it has to be backed in a more significant and committed way by the West. Stalled funds have to be released to support in its war effort. Munitions needs to be increased. Supply of munitions needs to be increased. And Ukraine's killing power needs to be maximised. Now, it's a very blunt way of describing how Ukraine may be able to win this war. And even with maximum support, may I add, the outcome of the war is not decided. But I think everybody should be pretty clear-eyed about it. It is a war across a 620-mile front that is essentially now an attritional war. If either side can kill enough of the opposing army in order to break their capability and will to continue fighting, then that war will be decided. If not, then Ukraine could well be forced into a position where it has to make a loser's peace, ceding territory, and then having to brace itself for another round of war at a time with Russia at a time in the near future. So that's where we are. But money and munitions and men are the key elements at the moment in this war.
So is that what it would take for it to flip the other way, for it to be Russia that has to make some kind of loser's peace if the West de-stall those weapons and actually come up with what
and
Ukraine
that
want?
money? I mean, at the moment, we're talking about $50 billion of US aid held up by Senate Republicans and 50 billion euros of EU funding held up principally by Hungary. But there won't be an easy flip, as I say. That will be no guarantee. Wars, controlled by, there's all sorts of jokers in the pack in a war. It's controlled by the dynamic of chaos. But I think listeners should be reminded that at the moment, Russia's training capability allows it to put about 130,000 fresh troops in coherent formations into the field every 6 months. And the Estonian Ministry of Defence recently published a very good analysis of the war and noted that to break Russia's sustainability of manpower, the Ukrainians would need to kill or wound about 50,000 Russian soldiers every 6 months. So these are the kind of bleak equations we're discussing in this war. There's a lot Ukraine could do. I mean, there's to improve its own capabilities. It's now in a strategic defensive posture. The counteroffensive of the summer has run out of steam. In 2024, it needs to keep itself slow and paced in an attritional war of defense, just from Ukraine's point of view, to regather and regroup its army, its forces, hoping its infrastructure can withstand, hoping it won't run out of funds, in order to take the war back to Russia perhaps in the autumn. But we're talking about a long-term war of very bleak options in which, at the moment, Russia probably has the upper hand.
And where do you see this conflict in, for example, I don't know, you pick your timescale, in 2 years, in 5 years? Do you think that can it still be going on at this level or not?
Oh, it could definitely be going on in 2 years at this level. Russia sees it as a battle of wills, and Russia interprets its own will as being stronger and its own level of patience and endurance as exceeding those of the West. It may or may not be right there. If the West did focus itself, then its own military industrial base and economic power far exceeds that of Russia. But this could go on unless one or other side breaks in the field. This could go on at least for another 2 years. But I mean, let's be clear that both sides are fighting a war of maximalist aims at the moment. The Russian strategic objective is the total subjugation of Ukraine. Ukraine's strategic objective seems to be to regain all of its sovereign territory and beat Russia in a way that the war doesn't reignite in a few years' time. So between those two maximalist aims, a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of munitions, this could run for some time.
I don't know how recently you spoke to Ukrainian forces on the front line, but have they changed in their attitude at all about the bigger goal?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the war escalated in February last year at a time when Ukraine had a regular army. That regular army has largely been annihilated now. There's a second wave army, which was volunteers with the survivors of the regular army. That army has been heavily degraded. We are now looking at an army increasingly of mobilized men. So you have got the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, people who are waiters in bars, people who are, in shops now on the front line. That, of course, carries a different sense of motivation and a different sense of commitment. Overall, Ukraine remains committed to fighting its war. But, it's been a very tough year on the battlefield for Ukraine. At the moment, there are two acute Russian offensives going on in Avdiivka and Kupiansk. Bakhmut was lost earlier in the war, in the year, to the Ukrainians. The counteroffensive has kind of petered out, having only gained between 8 and 12 mile advance of the further 55 miles needed to cut the land bridge to Crimea. So there is a gloomier atmosphere. Now, that's not a defeatist atmosphere. That's just more of a realistic atmosphere. People realize it's going to take a long time. And, every village now has lost a lot of its men. I mean, there's military graves up in every little community across Ukraine.